Welcome back to Proxam, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about the special rule, Sudden Assault. So this is a special rule that's unique to Craftworld Eldar. It's an ability that allows you to essentially deep strike instead of deploying normally. And this is a very powerful ability, but there is a time and a place to use it, and a lot of newer players might be thinking that they should use it all the time, but that's really not the case. There's a lot of instances where you really don't want to use it, and in some cases, using it can actually get your unit killed very quickly and basically, waste your unit. So you don't want to do that, obviously. You don't want your unit to die before it gets to do anything, and you certainly don't want to put a unit in a position, especially an Eldar unit, in a position where it just can't do anything or, doesn't have any impact, because our units are fairly expensive. They're not very cheap. So in this video, we're going to be basically reviewing the Sudden Assault rule and how it works. We're going to be looking at which units have access to the rule. I'm going to be talking a little bit about why you should or shouldn't use Sudden Assault with a couple of the units. And I'm also going to be talking about when you should and shouldn't use Sudden Assault and why. So, like I previously stated, Sudden Assault is a rule that allows you to set up your unit as reinforcements. The unit can deploy anywhere outside of 9 inches from enemy units. So, some quick things about Sudden Assault that a lot of new players misunderstand or misconstrue when they start playing. First of all, Sudden Assault does not actually require command points unless you're using the Webway Strike stratagem, which is basically gives Sudden Assault to a unit in your army. Unless you're using that stratagem, it does not require CP. So if you want to put your Swooping Hawks or Warp Spiders or whatever, deploy them as reinforcements from reserves, it doesn't actually require any command cost. So that means that you don't have to pay CP for it. So it's not like strategic reserves in that way. Another thing, it still counts against the 50% reinforcements rule when declaring reinforcements. So the reinforcements rule is you cannot have more than 50% of your points and units in reserve. However, you can use Phantasm to override this. So what you could do is you could deploy 49% or whatever of your forces in reserve as reinforcements, and then you could use Phantasm to redeploy even more units in reserve. So you could do that, but when you initially state your reinforcements, you can't have more than 50% as reinforcements. Also, in matched play, you can arrive on turn 2 or 3, any later, and they count as destroyed. So you do have to remember to bring them in. It's not one of those things like it is in the past where you could bring them in on turn 5 or turn 4. Remember those days in 5th edition. You can't do that anymore because basically it was too cheap, too cheesy to do that. So you have to essentially bring them in on turn 2 or 3. You can't bring them in on turn 1 unless they have the Cloud Strike special rule as well, because matched play basically prevents turn 1 reinforcements, which kind of makes sense because a lot of people were just alpha striking and destroying people right away when they could come in on turn 1. So you can't do that, but you can come in on turn 2 or 3. So which units have access to Sudden Assault? So basically these are the units that have access to it. Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, Baroth, an Autarch with wings or a Warp Jump Generator, and the Falcon, and of course units that are using the Webway Strike stratagem. So even though it's not technically Sudden Assault, the Webway Strike stratagem, it's essentially the same thing. It's basically what that is. So I went ahead and included that in here as well. Now, a couple of things to note about Swooping Hawks and Baroth. They both have the Skyleap ability. So the Skyleap ability essentially allows them to redeploy anywhere they want on the board instead of battle focusing. So it's basically an insane battle focus. Now here's the thing. If you use Sudden Assault with these guys, you cannot Skyleap in the same turn. They would be ineligible to be able to use Skyleap. So in general, using Sudden Assault on either Baroth or Swooping Hawks is a bad idea. For one, they basically already get this ability that they can use turn 1. They can deploy anywhere they want. Second, you're wasting a turn of shooting. So Swooping Hawks can actually move forward turn 1, shoot something, and then Skyleap back to safety. They wouldn't normally be able to do this if they're in Sudden well, if they're using sudden assault. So there are some cases where you might want to do it, where you want to keep them safe from ignores line of sight weapons. Maybe you're playing against an Imperial Guard player, bring a lot of mortars or something like that, which some Imperial Guard players do because of the special rule that basically allows them to ignore the penalties to indirect fire. But unless you're facing something like that, you probably don't want to actually deploy them in sudden assault. It's better to deploy them on the board, move them up, hide them, and then use Sky Leap when needed. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, when should you and shouldn't you use sudden assault and why? So if you're planning to use sudden assault, you should consider using it in these scenarios. So 1, your opponent doesn't have a lot of screening units. So maybe your opponent has a very small elite army, something like Grey Knights. Grey Knights don't have easy access to screening units. They do have a couple of screening units in the form of henchmen and things like that, but it's not too much. And normally Grey Knight armies don't really go with those anyway. They usually go with the strike squads, which are very elite small units. And there's similar armies like Death Watch and things like that may not actually have real good screening units. They may have things like an Auspex scan. So that's the other thing. If your opponent doesn't have easy access to Auspex scan and he doesn't have any powerful shooting units in that vicinity, then you should consider using sudden assault. Typically, your opponent isn't going to waste 2 command points shooting pistols at you. That's typically not going to happen. So if you do use sudden assault, you're pretty safe if you deep strike next to a unit that's either assault oriented or doesn't have strong shooting attacks. And again, even regular bolters, I doubt an opponent is going to waste 2 command points for, basically to shoot bolters at you. That's typically not going to happen. Also, you should also think about using sudden assault if it's part of a larger offensive push with multiple different units. Because sudden assault basically allows you to come in whenever you want, doing this will allow you to have the flexibility to put them in reserve and come in whenever your forces decide to make a strong offensive push. And it gives you a little bit more room to maneuver in the beginning of the game, so you don't have to hide as many units behind obscuring terrain. This gives you a little bit more room on the board to do so. So all your wave serpents and stuff won't be crowded behind obscuring terrain so that the enemy can see you. You'll be able to make a little more room. And lastly, you can also really consider using sudden assault when you can land at a line of sight of enemy units, but in threat range for next turn. So land at a line of sight so you can, don't have to be shot at or whatever. And you can do various things with this. If there's no enemies in the vicinity, you can score points on objectives like behind enemy lines, things like that. There's a lot of different things you can do with this. So if it's possible, you should really consider landing that unit at a line of sight of enemy units. But again, in threat range of enemy units next turn, because you definitely don't want to use a unit of warp spiders or something like that as a basically secondary objective capture, whatever, right? You don't want to do that because that's just a waste of points. You want to use other units for that. You want to use a Viper for that. You want to use Rangers for that, right? Guardians maybe. You definitely don't want to use an expensive unit like warp spiders to be using actions or secondary actions all game. It's just not worth their points, right? They can do more than just that. So you do want to use sudden assault if you can land at a line of sight, but you want to be careful about wasting your unit's potential. Okay, so we went over why you should use it. So why shouldn't you use sudden assault? So you shouldn't use sudden assault if your opponent is well screened. He has a lot of screening units and he's really self-conscious about actually setting up his screens. So if you see this, it'll be very obvious that he's screening because he'll spread his guys out a little bit. That means he is screening for his models, and he'll be measuring 9 inches, in the deployment and so forth, back and forth between his different units to make sure you can't land there. If he is doing that, you might want to consider not coming in right away, either delaying your arrival, or you may want to just consider, honestly, not using sudden assault at all if you notice this. Or, if it's already too late, for example, you're already using sudden assault, you might want to get away from that part of the army. Also, if your opponent has access to powerful shooting units with Auspex scan, something like Devastators or Eradicators, then you really should hold off on deep striking within range of their Auspex scan. That is it's a very bad idea. Now, in casual play, most players will just go ahead and tell you, oh, I have an Auspex scan, you might not want to land there. Let me tell you something. This is not always the case with players. Some players do not actually do this, okay? We would like to think that in a perfect world, people are nice to new players and they tell them all the rules and they help them out. But in reality, you have to look for two things when you're deep striking in. You have to look for A, does your opponent have 2 command points available, which they probably will, to use the Auspex scan? B, do they have a powerful shooting unit in that vicinity that can actually be in range of it to use it? Because they will use it. A lot of the times, it's just something that some players will not tell you about. Let me give you an example. When I first started playing and the new Space Marine Codex came out and Auspex scan was like a newer thing, I played against my buddy, and honestly, I have great games against this guy. I love playing him, stuff like that. But to be honest with you, he was a little bit of a dick. He didn't tell me about Auspex scan, okay? So there are players who won't tell you. Even if they're considered, quote unquote nice guys or whatever, they just won't tell you about it. Maybe they forgot it themselves and just recognized it as soon as you deep striked in. It just clicked in their mind. Oh, you know what? I'm going to use Auspex scan, okay? So players do that kind of thing. They're absolutely not always going to tell you, especially if you're a new player. And I had to let them do it that game. I had to say, you know what, that's fair. Maybe I should have known about the rule. I lost my unit of Swooping Hawks very easily. So beware of that. Always ask your opponent, or just be aware of the fact that they have it and don't deep strike near very good shooting units like Eradicators. The next thing is when you have no other units to support and follow up with. So I think this is one of the biggest mistakes new players make is they'll throw a unit with sudden assault right against the enemy army, right against their lines, without units to support them. So they'll drop a unit of warp spiders right in front of the enemy, they'll shoot, kill a couple models, and then inevitably they'll die right after. And the reason why this is bad is because A, you're not fulfilling the unit's potential, which is, with Eldar units, you really have to try to get them to shoot multiple turns to make up their points, especially units of 5 warp spiders or 5 swooping hawks and things like that. They're not meant to just be thrown in there and die. They're not an alpha strike type unit, to be honest. So if you do this, not only are you not making their points up, which is the main thing, but also you're just not unlocking the potential of the unit, which again, warp spiders and swooping hawks can be very effective in enemy backlines, either getting points on things like behind enemy lines or just harassing key targets in the backfield, making it hard for your opponent to really do anything without being harassed all the way through. So if you land them in front of your opponent's army, then your opponent's just going to move forward, shoot them, and pretend like nothing even happened, right? So your opponent's going to get a good trade, first of all. You're going to get a bad trade, and it's not going to stop your opponent from doing anything that they weren't already going to do. So if you do use Sudden Assault, you definitely want to have units coming into support. If you don't have any units to come support that Deep Striker, then chances are you probably don't want to Deep Strike him in that position. Okay, so here are a few examples of situations where you may or may not want to actually deep strike in with Sudden Assault. So this is the first example here. We land within 12 inches of an enemy unit within a ruin in the backfield. Now this may seem like a really good position behind enemy lines, one, and in cover, right? And you're within 12, so your unit of warp spiders or whatever can shoot them. But if the enemy unit is a strong shooting unit like Eradicators or something like that, and they have Auspex scan available to them, this would be a bad idea, because basically what's going to happen is if you're not out of line of sight, and if you're out of line of sight, you can't shoot anyway. So even though you may want to do this to disrupt the unit in some cases, you're not going to be doing any damage, and they could easily just move back a little bit and shoot you next turn. So if this happens and they have Auspex scan, they can easily destroy part or whole or all of your unit basically before you have the chance to shoot. So while this scenario may look great on the outside, I'm going to drop my warp spiders in, I'm going to destroy your Eradicators, and then I'm going to be, immune from, shooting. It's actually not that great because A, you're within 12, so they're going to be able to Auspex scan you, and a lot of armies actually have 18-inch Auspex scan, so beware of that. And B, you know, you're not going to be getting the full use out of your unit. You may actually lose it before you get the chance to shoot. So, lastly on this, honestly, if you notice something like this, your enemy could easily be baiting you. I've known a lot of instances of good players that deliberately leave their shooting units not screened properly, because what they'll want to do is they want to bait you into landing in there so that they can auspex scan you and kill you. Honestly, a lot of players, I know some of you out there, no, my buddy would never do that. You always tell me about this. And that could be the case for a lot of opponents, right? Your local gaming group could be different. But honestly, when you're in your local hobby shop and you're just getting a pickup game with someone random, you never know what you're going to get. I hate to say it. There's hobbyists that are really great guys, really good players. But for those new players out there, there's people that are dicks and they won't tell you about it. In fact, they'll deliberately bait you with something like this just so they can kill your unit with auspex scan. So beware. Just beware. Just be aware of it. Here's another example of when you really don't want to use sudden assault. So just because you can drop into a situation doesn't mean you always should. So in this example here, your unit can fit into the back zone, into the deployment zone. You found a little crevice where they could fit in. And maybe his units aren't really strong shooting units, so he doesn't really have, the chance to auspex scan you. But you still don't really want to deploy in this way because look, you're surrounded by enemy units, and to be honest, next turn, your enemy is just going to very easily dispatch you without really wasting too much resources. You're way out in the open, you're not hidden at all, and they have the benefit of cover in every single direction. So you really don't want to do something like this. I saw a player actually do this, not with Eldar, but with Space Marines. He dropped the unit of Assault Marines in someone's backfield like this, and it was just, honestly, it was just kind of pathetic because the opponent turned around, blasted his guys off the table, and really just didn't lose any steps. Still completed his secondary objectives, still secured that area of the board, and the opponent was basically just wasted an Assault Marine squad. So you don't want to do this with your Eldar, especially with your Eldar. They're very fragile. It's not going to take as much firepower to take them out, and it's just going to be an easy target for your opponent. So don't do something like this. Okay, another example where you probably don't want to deep strike in, probably want to wait a little bit for your, friendly forces to take some of this stuff out or whatever, open a hole for you, is if the area of the board is well screened and there's no place to land except in front of enemy forces. So there's no way you can get behind the ruins without being screened out, and if you land in front of them, you can't get to their juicy targets. So it's better to wait until your friendly forces come in and destroy a couple of the units before actually dropping in. So maybe turn one, you go up and you destroy that unit on the bottom right in the light cover, and then you destroy the unit on the top right in the light cover. And then you can deep strike in either turn 2 or turn 3 when those things are there, and you can come in and destroy that dreadnought on the objective, or you can come shoot at that vehicle if it's still there or whatever. That would be a better option and give you a better trade than landing in front of enemy forces and just being basically wasted. So do be aware, if your opponent is screening very well, you have to be able to kill those screening units beforehand during the first couple turns of the game. Maybe don't come in until turn 3. That would be honestly preferable to just landing in front of them and just not getting their points back and giving your opponent, again, another easy target to shoot and kill. Okay, so those were a couple of examples of when you shouldn't use sudden assault. This is an example of when you should. So if there's a situation like this where your opponent's really concentrated around that objective, your opponent has a couple units in the ruins giving supporting fire to that unit on the objective, maybe has a character on the objective as well, very tough or something like that. In this scenario, you can actually land right behind the enemy ruin, still be outside of 9 inches, shoot the enemy units in the ruin with support, of course, from other units in the board. To be honest with you, it doesn't matter how souped up your Warp Spider squad is or whatever. If you have a unit of 10 or 2 units of 5, they're still not going to be able to kill 10 Space Marines in terrain without support. So they're going to need things like Jinx. They're going to need things like Reveal, maybe some other shooting from something else. But if you're able to do this, it's really awesome because your opponent can't retaliate against you. So you can set up something like this where you're deep striking in his backlines, or her, I guess, to be honest with you, I have a habit of saying his all the time in these videos, and it's not meant as anything, but except that I've actually never seen a girl play Warhammer. So I just assume it. But, if there's any girls out there who play, I'm sorry. It's just, it's a habit of mine to say his. But I guess their forces, right? So you destroy their Space Marine units or whatever that's in the ruin. And then at that point, you have the chance to force your opponent to either A, have to go back and run off the objective to shoot your Warp Spider unit and kill you, or your opponent just has to sit there and just accept the fact that the Warp Spiders are probably going to swing around the ruin the next turn and shoot off either the unit in light cover or the unit on the objective, or maybe even the character, right? Your opponent kind of just has to accept that or try to find another way to deal with the Warp Spiders. This can put your opponent into a very compromising position in which there's really no good answer and your opponent just kind of has to take it at that point. So in conclusion, I think Sudden Assault is a fantastic ability with a lot of applications, but you have to be very selective and aware of when you use it, or it could end in absolute disaster. So generally speaking, if your opponent has a lot of low-value screening troops or ample Auspex scan access, you're much better off deploying on the board normally, but out of line of sight, or maybe waiting until the board clears up a bit. In both of these cases, you're much better off doing that than using Sudden Assault and having no good place to put your unit. So you definitely don't want to do that. You definitely don't want to land your forces isolated in front of the enemy army. That's not a good idea. It'll always get your unit killed and you'll always trade badly. You want to either make sure that they're, again, part of a bigger push, or you're using them strategically behind terrain and things like that, where you can leverage more against your opponent than just shooting them once and then dying. All right, everybody, that's it for today's video. I will see you guys later. I do want to address a couple things. I tried to have a live stream earlier this week. It did not pan out because of some technical difficulties. I do plan to have more live streams in the future, but I have to fix a few things and find out what happened with that program that I was using online. It's going to have to be changed, or I'm going to have to figure out why there was no sound to it. So stay tuned for those. I'll probably announce it within the coming week when I'm going to do it next, try it out again and see if it works. And try to get that going, because I do want to have some, short kind of live streams with you guys talking about a couple of the new updates that are coming. I know there's, a new Imperial Guard Codex coming out. I want to talk about that, matchup versus Eldar in a live stream. I also want to talk about, potentially 10th edition coming out, as well as the new balance data slate that's stated to come out at the end of the month. So I definitely want to talk about those things with you. And I think it'd be really cool to do so in a live stream. So we're going to try to do that later on. And again, anybody who joined that live stream or is part of that live stream, I do apologize for the, basically technical difficulties. I'm going to try to get those fixed as soon as possible this week. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I will see you guys later. Thanks for watching and have a good one, everybody. Peace out. See you guys later.